this space. The varied perspectives. These are the journalisms by way of critical aggregation, illuminated from the analytic research of a historiographer, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement will likely share our soul and accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully play.
Engage impulse engines. Engage.
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 Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage.
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 Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage. Does Assad's UAE visit signal Syria rejoining the Arab League? Watch this space. UAE top official calls for end to war, chaos in Syria after Assad visit. Anwar Gargash, the diplomatic advisor to the UAE's president, has called for an end to the war and destruction in Syria amid rapprochement between Arab states and Damascus. In a tweet, Gargash reiterated his country's support for the return of Syria to its environment, noting that this was confirmed by the UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan during his Sunday meeting with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. A decade-and-a-half war, violence, destruction is enough, and it's time to enhance cooperation and solidarity among our Arab countries to ensure the stability and prosperity of the region, Gargash said. Syria's membership in the Arab League was suspended following the eruption of a foreign-backed militancy in the country in 2011. The UAE's approach and efforts towards brotherly Syria are part of a deeper vision of a broader approach aimed at strengthening Arab and regional stability and overcoming difficult years of confrontation, Gargash said. The UAE cut its relation with Syria in 2012, a year after Damascus found itself in the grips of foreign-backed violence, but it reopened its embassy in Damascus in 2018. In the latest sign of developing thaw in ties between the two countries, Assad, accompanied by his wife Asma al-Assad, arrived in Abu Dhabi on Sunday for an official visit. It was her first foreign trip since 2011. Amid rapprochement between Arab states and Syria, reports said Saudi Arabia will reopen its consulate in the Syrian capital Damascus soon. Russia's Sputnik news agency cited sources as saying that diplomatic breakthrough is brokered by Russia and the UAE. According to the report, the consulate is expected to reopen after Eid al-Fitr, which will be celebrated late in April. The sources said the reopening will be preceded by a visit by the Saudi foreign minister to Damascus to meet President al-Assad and Syrian officials. Saudi Arabia closed its embassy in Damascus and withdrew all diplomats in March 2012. From minutemirror.com.pk, Bashar al-Assad's UAE visit focused at diplomatic momentum of improved ties. The president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, met with Emirati authorities on Sunday in Abu Dhabi on his second trip to the Gulf to spark renewed efforts to reunite Damascus with the Arab world. During high-level discussions at the presidential palace, the president of the UAE, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, received Assad and his wife, Asma, in the capital, according to the official news agency WAM. We held constructive talks aimed at developing relations between our two countries, the Emirati president said in a statement. Our discussions also explored ways of enhancing cooperation to accelerate stability and progress in Syria and the region, Sheikh Mohammed added. According to analysts, Damascus's relations with Middle Eastern nations that had so far resisted normalization after more than a decade of conflict may benefit from the diplomatic momentum created in the wake of the earthquake. Anwar Gargash, a senior advisor to the Emirati president, said that the UAE's strategy and actions towards Syria were part of a larger strategy and deeper vision aimed at enhancing Arab and regional stability. The UAE's position is clear regarding the nation and its return to its place in the Arab world and regain legitimacy in the region, Gargash said on Twitter. According to a statement released by the Syrian president, Assad hailed the UAE's contribution to improving ties among Arab nations during their meeting. The Syrian president criticized the idea of cutting links between Arab groups as an incorrect paradigm in politics, adding that contact should be fraternal, according to the statement. UAE calls for return of Syria back into the Arab family. This is from Bold News. When President al-Assad arrived in Qatar, Qasr al-Watan in Abu Dhabi, he was greeted with a ceremonial reception. Sheikh Mohammed escorted Syria's president to the platform, where the Syrian national song was played and 21 rounds of artillery were fired to welcome his visit. Sheikh Tanoun bin Zayed Al Nahyan, National Security Advisor Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of the Presidential Court Sheikh Hamdan bin Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Sheikh Mohammed bin Hamad bin Tanoun Al Nahyan, Advisor for Special Affairs of the Presidential Court Ministry, Ali Mohammed Hamad Al Shamsi, Secretary General of the Supreme Council for National Security, Dr. Anwar Garga, Secretary Dr. Samir Al Khalil, Syrian Minister of Economic and Foreign Trade, Mansour Fadlal Azam, Syrian Minister of Presidential Affairs, Petrus Al-Halak, Syrian Minister of Information, Dr. Ayman Sosan, Syrian Deputy Foreign Minister, and Dr. Ghassan Abbas, charge of affairs of the Syrian embassy in the UAE, comprised the Syrian president's delegation. Sheikh Mohammed and Bashar al-Assad met to discuss the two countries' fraternal relations and methods to increase collaboration and constructive collaborative effort that would contribute to attaining their mutual objectives. Sheikh Mohammed welcomed the Syrian president and his delegation to his second country during the meeting at Qasr al-Watan. He noted that the tour falls in the same month as the Syrian president's visit to the country in March of last year. Sheikh Mohammed expressed his sympathies to Syria's president and the Syrian people for the earthquake victims. He emphasized his belief in Syria's capabilities and the commitment of its people to overcome this adversity and usher the country into a new era. Syria's absence from its brothers has been long, and it's time for its return to its Arab surroundings, Sheikh Mohammed said. He emphasized the importance of making every effort to facilitate the dignified return of Syrian refugees to their country. Sheikh Mohammed expressed the UAE's support for the conversation between Syria and Turkey in order to achieve progress on the issue of relocating refugees. He emphasized the UAE's unwavering support for Syria and its people. He lauded the UAE's Syrian community and stressed the importance of the UAE-Syria connection. The discussions also addressed the significance of building on recent regional advancements in order to promote stability, security, prosperity for the region's governments and people. Sheikh Mohammed welcomed al-Assad's visit to the UAE and emphasized the necessity of reintegrating Syria into the Arab world by bridging gaps and establishing ties among oil Arab countries. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad emphasized that UAE had always taken sensible and ethical positions and that it plays a good and useful role in the Middle East to ensure strong inter-Arab relations. Al-Assad emphasized that the participation of the UAE is consistent with the Syrian objective, which is to improve inter-Arab relations in preparation for unified Arab action. He praised Sheikh Mohammed, the UAE government, and the people of the UAE for their aid to Syrians in the aftermath of the catastrophic earthquake. And from Tasnim News, UAE Syrian presidents discuss Middle East stability in bilateral talks. The presidents of the United Arab Emirates and Syria, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan and Bashar Assad, respectively held talks in Abu Dhabi on Sunday to discuss the positive dynamics in the Middle East and ways to achieve stability in Arab countries. Assad arrived in the UAE earlier in the day with a delegation of ministers for the bilateral talks. Assad's office stated on Telegram that the talks touched upon bilateral relations between the countries and ways of strengthening them, and also focused on achieving stability in the region. The UAE's president emphasized the importance of building strong relations between all Arab states and returning Syria to the Arab world. The leaders also discussed economic cooperation. This visit marks the second time Assad's visited a Persian Gulf country since the earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey in February. Abu Dhabi's already approved $100 million in aid and sent hundreds of tons of humanitarian aid to Syria to help alleviate the disaster's consequence. And from College Times, watch, it's time for Syrians to return to their Arab families, says UAE president. Reassuring the earthquake survivors and victims, Sheikh Mohammed emphasized the country's solidarity, saying, UAE is with you in heart and spirit. The UAE President, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, welcomed Syrian President Bashar al-Assad at Qasr al-Watan on Sunday and said, "It's our aim to build relations with you. We wish to extend and strengthen the bridges between us and the people of Syria." Sheikh Mohammed posted a montage video of Assad's historic visit to the country, and during the bilateral talk he said, "To the people of Syria, it's been too long, and you've been missed. It's time for the Syrians to return to the Arab family." Sheikh Mohammed offered his condolences to the Syrian president and the people of Syria for the earthquake victims. He emphasized UAE's solidarity with Syria and added, "Your brothers in the UAE are with you in heart and in spirit." From Al Monitor, Assad's UAE visit aims to facilitate aid routes and Syria's return to Arab League. Proposals to facilitate humanitarian aid and bring Syria back to the Arab League topped the agenda in the Syrian president's visit to the United Arab Emirates since the beginning of the civil war. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad arrived in Abu Dhabi on Sunday on his second official visit to the United Arab Emirates. Discussions on bringing Syria back into the Arab League are gaining momentum, as well as on ways to bring more economic aid into the country. Assad arrived in the UAE on Sunday for his second trip to the oil-rich country and was greeted with great ceremony. Fighter jets escorted the Syrian delegation into UAE airspace, and it was welcomed by the country's president Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed on the tarmac. Syria's First Lady Asma al-Assad was personally welcomed by UAE's First Lady Sheikha Fatima bint Mubarak in a rare public appearance. The trip came at a high point of Arab re-engagement with Assad after years of his political isolation and amid efforts to bring Syria back into the Arab League. It was expelled in 2011 following Assad's brutal crackdown on the uprising. The visit to the UAE followed Assad's trip to Russia last week and to Oman. And let's take a moment to look at the clip. Give it a little volume.
علاقة ومد جسور وتقوية هذا الجسر بينه وبين أهلنا في سوريا فائدة الطرفين.
This is Shtayyeh. To the people of Syria, it's been far too long and you've been missed. It's time for the Syrians to return to their Arab family. It's our aim to build relations with you. We wish to extend and strengthen the bridges between us and the people of Syria for the benefit of both sides. May Allah bless you and the people of Syria. With Allah's will and your leadership in the efforts and determination of the Syrian people, you'll overcome this challenge. Your brothers in the UAE are with you in heart and spirit. Assad, thank you for your highness. He who does not thank the people is not thankful to Allah. Therefore, it's essential to start with Syria. Today, after a month has passed when Syrians speak, what state is the absolute certainty that the UAE support is filled with love. This is the most valuable thing that can be offered. Additionally, with Allah's will, we too will remain committed to this relationship. I came to know Sheikh Zayed, may he rest in peace, through brief encounters. My father had a deep bond with him. I came to know him through occasional meetings, and it became clear that he was a kind and beloved person. Today I can see this picture even more clearly, and we appreciate now exactly the kind of country he built and the family he raised. Allah bless you, Mr. President. I'd like to assure you that we're brothers, we're family. We're honored by your presence today, and we hope this visit will be the foundation. We'll build a strong bridge to help establish relationships that'll serve the interests of our entire region. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. We'll be back with more news. Putin says ready to discuss China's Ukraine plan at Z talks. Chinese leader Xi Jinping visits Moscow days after the ICC issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Russian President Vladimir Putin has warmly welcomed Chinese leader Xi Jinping on a visit to the Kremlin, sending a message to Western leaders that their efforts to isolate Moscow over its war in Ukraine have fallen short. Xi's trip, his first abroad since his re-election earlier this month, began on Monday and showed off Beijing's new diplomatic swagger. It also gave a political lift to Putin just days after an international arrest warrant was issued for the Kremlin leader on war crimes charges related to Ukraine. The Chinese leader's been trying to portray Beijing as a potential peacemaker in Ukraine, even as he deepens economic ties with Moscow. Putin and Xi greeted one another as dear friends when they met in the Kremlin, and Russian state news agencies later reported they held informal talks for nearly 4.5 hours on Monday, with further official talks scheduled for Tuesday. His televised comments after they greeted each other, Putin told Xi he viewed China's proposal for a resolution of the Ukraine war with respect. He confessed to being slightly envious of China's very effective system for development and economy and strengthening the state. Putin congratulated Xi on his re-election and voiced hope for building even stronger ties. China's made a colossal leap ahead in its development in years, Putin said, adding that it's causing genuine interest all around the world, and we even feel a bit envious, as Xi smiled. Xi, for his part, praised Putin and predicted Russians would re-elect him next year. And from CGTN, Chinese President Xi Jinping meets with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Chinese President Xi Jinping met with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin on his arrival in Moscow on Monday. When Xi reached the Kremlin, he was greeted by the Kremlin commandant and the alighting point. Putin warmly shook hands and took photos with Xi. The two presidents had an in-depth and candid exchange on China-Russia relations and issues of mutual interest. Xi stressed that there's a profound historical logic for China-Russia relationship to reach where it is today. China and Russia are each other's biggest neighbors and comprehensive strategic partners of coordination. Both countries see their relationship as a high priority in the overall diplomacy and policy on external affairs. China always upholds an independent foreign policy to consolidate and develop well China-Russia relations as strategic choice China's made on the basis of its own fundamental interest in the prevailing trends of the world, said Xi. China's firm in keeping to the general direction of the strengthening strategic coordination with Russia, Xi said, adding that both China and Russia are committed to realizing national development and rejuvenation, support world multipolarity, and work for greater democracy and international relations. Xi said the two countries should further deepen practical cooperation in various fields and strengthen coordination and collaboration on multilateral platforms such as the UN to boost their respective national development and rejuvenation. Putin extended a warm welcome to Xi for his state visit to Russia and once again warmly congratulated him on his re-election as Chinese president. With concerted efforts by both sides, Russia-China relations in recent years have delivered fruitful results in various areas, Putin said, adding that Russia stands ready to continue to deepen bilateral practical cooperation, step up communication and collaboration in international affairs, and promote world multipolarity and greater democracy in international relations. The two sides had an in-depth exchange of views on the Ukraine issue. Xi stressed that on the Ukraine issue, voices for peace and rationality are building. Most countries support easing tensions, stand for peace talks, and are against adding fuel to the fire. A review of history says that conflicts in the end have to be settled through dialogue and negotiation. China released a document on its position on the Ukraine crisis, advocating the political settlement of the crisis and rejecting the Cold War mentality and unilateral sanctions, said Xi. China believes that the more difficulties there are, the greater the need to keep space for peace. The more acute the problem is, the more important it is not to give up efforts for dialogue. China will continue to play a constructive role in promoting the political settlement of the Ukraine issue, said Xi. For his part, Putin said that Russia appreciates China for consistently upholding an impartial, objective, and balanced position and standing for fairness and justice on major international issues. Russia has carefully studied China's position paper on the political settlement of the Ukraine issue, and it's open for talks of peace. Russia welcomes China to play a constructive role in this regard, the two presidents said, and they look forward to formal talks on the next day to draw up new blueprint for China-Russia. And they say that strategic partnership of coordination is in years to come. From South China Morning Post, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meet in Moscow discussing China's peace. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meet in Moscow to discuss Chinese peace plan for Ukraine. Washington and its allies are skeptical that Xi can be an honest broker. U.S. urges China and Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the two leaders meet for 4.5 hours, and Russian media reports that Putin went out into the street to see Xi off as they parted, a rare move for him. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian leader Vladimir Putin met for more than 4 hours on Monday in Moscow, discussing topics that included bilateral cooperation, the war in Ukraine, a peace plan proposed by Beijing, according to Russian and Chinese state media. Xi's visit, which will last for 3 days, has drawn scrutiny and suspicion from the West, the U.S., and its allies. They've argued that China is hardly a neutral party given its diplomatic and material support for Russia since it invaded Ukraine a year ago. And from Axios, what Putin and Xi each get out of their friendship. Chinese President Xi Jinping signaling solidarity with his dear friend Vladimir Putin this week in Moscow, a visit that also underscores Russia's reliance on China to keep its economy and war machine running. China's help shield Russia from Western efforts to isolate it following the invasion of Ukraine significantly increased imports of Russian oil and become an even more crucial source for Russia of key inputs like microchips. The visit follows warnings from Washington that Xi might start backing the Russian war effort with weapons, claims Beijing denies. Thus far, China's not only openly breached Western sanctions or provided arms to Russia, in fact, Beijing is attempting to position itself as a mediator. Putin said Monday that he looks forward to discussing Xi's recent peace proposal in detail. Putin also thanked Xi in an article published in Chinese state media for understanding the true causes of the conflict. Chinese officials and state media have echoed Putin's arguments that NATO is to blame. More recently, Beijing condemned the double standards at the International Criminal Court after it issued a warrant for Putin's arrest on Friday. Between the lines, Xi's pseudo-neutrality can be summed up by his itinerary this week: a 3-day state visit with Putin, a planned phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. A European official recently told reporters in Washington that one potential nightmare scenario is that the military balance of the war shifts toward Russia, Western influence diminishes, and Chinese mediation starts to seem far more plausible. This is hilarious. This Axios article has a bullet point here that says it acts as though what is happening could be, potentially happening, right? I think that's really funny. A European official recently told reporters in Washington, who is this European official, first off? Unsourced European official. That one potential nightmare scenario is that the military balance of the war shifts toward Russia. Check. Western influence diminishes. Check. And Chinese mediation starts to seem far more plausible. The big picture, while Xi may consider Putin his best friend, he has more practical reasons for aligning with Moscow. Russia remains a key source of oil, arms, and military technology for China. It's also an ideological ally for China in its rivalry with the U.S., with a seat on the UN Security Council, says Alexander Gabuev, an expert on the Russia-China relationship at the Carnegie Endowment. In an article of his own published Monday in the Russian press, Xi called for cooperation to confront damaging acts of hegemony, domination, and bullying. Chinese leaders often make Moscow the first trip of a new term, but Xi's decision to opt for a full state visit is a statement that will stand by Russia, Gabuev says. Between the lines, expect 3 days of handshake, smiles, pomp and circumstance in Moscow, at least in public. Dinner tonight was a 7-course affair featuring quail blinis, Siberian salmon, venison and cherry sauce, and wine from Russia's Black Sea coast, according to menus posted on Twitter. But the balance of power between the neighbors has flipped since the Soviet era, particularly since the invasion. Trade with China now accounts for more than 30% of Russia's total imports and exports, but just 3% of China's. That gives Xi a lot of leverage with his giant neighbor. Continuing the war for Putin is more important than any attempt to keep a balance or strategic autonomy, Gabuev says. Since the war is organizing the principle of Russian foreign policy now, whoever gives you the ability to continue is your best friend. and we'll be back with more news. And from Mayor, Nationalization of Iranian Oil Industry. Led by Prime Minister Mossadegh and religious figures such as Ayatollah Khamenei, the nationalization of Iran's oil entered a new phase on Esfand 29, or March 20th, after the Majlis passed the related legislation. The movement sought to cut the hands of Britain that was exploiting Iran's oil and giving a tiny portion back to the country. London could not tolerate such a movement for many reasons, and hence set the stage for a coup against Mossadegh 2 years later with the cooperation of the United States. Western companies had been involved in the extraction of oil in Iran and other countries in the Middle East since extraction had become technically and financially feasible. By the end of the 1940s, there was a growing resentment in Iran to the huge imbalance in oil revenues that the British government and the Iranian government were receiving from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, formerly the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Similarly, arrangements between the U.S. and countries such as Saudi Arabia seemed more equitable, and in 1950 Britain offered a new concession to Iraq with regard to oil revenue. This fueled a surge in anti-British rhetoric, with the leader of the National Front of Iran, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, leading calls to end foreign influence in Iran and nationalizing the industry. This call was supported by Ayatollah Khamenei, a leading cleric, and Mossadegh was made prime minister in March 1951 after the previous prime minister had been assassinated. Mossadegh then moved quickly. On 15 March 1951, he passed a law nationalizing IOC with immediate effect, which was verified by the Iranian parliament 2 days later. He gave all British employees of AIOC a week to leave the country, and Ayatollah Khamenei even declared a national day of hatred against the British government. Sanctions followed, and the move galvanized the British to help orchestrate the overthrow of Mossadegh in June 1953. Nonetheless, the decision to stand up to Western domination and determine its own future in such a way is seen as a key event in the history of
officials say lies some.
In the first year of the nationalization, the only foreign sale of Iranian oil was 300 barrels to an Italian merchant ship. Foreign oil companies prevented any impacts of the Iranian withdrawal from being felt by consumer countries by increasing output elsewhere. Oil production was expanded by BP and Aramco in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq. Oil production in the Middle East increased by around 10% annually in 1951, 52, and 53. With Iranian oil production decreasing from 242 million barrels in 1950 to 10.6 million barrels in 1952, the loss of oil exports severely impacted the economy. In August 1953, the government of Mossadegh was overthrown by a military coup d'etat orchestrated by the United States Central Intelligence Agency and the British Secret Intelligence Service. Mossadegh was sentenced to 3 years in prison and then kept under house arrest until his death in 1967. After the coup, the Iranian oil crisis ended, and the AIOC did not succeed to stop production. The National Iranian Oil Company as an international consortium was founded, and the AIOC was made a member. Iran, self-sufficient in constructing oil gas refineries. Delivering a speech during ceremony marking the anniversary of Iran's oil industry nationalization to inaugurate the first part of the second phase of a project aimed at increasing and sustaining Abadan refinery's production capacity, the minister said 31 semi-finished projects valued at $12 billion were put into operation in the Iranian calendar March 21st, 2022, or the year 1401. The Ministry of Petroleum and the nation, Iranian Oil Refining and Distribution Company, have given top priority to the completion of partly finished and national projects, said Augie, adding the newly inaugurated project was among them, which has made 64% progress when the incumbent administration took office, and the remaining 36% work was done in 18 months. More than 100 contractors participated in the project completion process, mentioned Augie, continuing that the most complicated job of Abadan Refinery Phase 2 was done in an unprecedented measure during the period, while oil exports had decreased and further sanctions had been imposed on the country when President Ibrahim Raisi took office. Shifting to the incumbent administration's energy diplomacy, the minister said some $5 million of foreign investments have been so far attracted to develop oil and gas fields. The country signed gas contracts with other countries, stated LG, referring to the settlement of the issue with Turkmenistan, whose relations with Iran had been strained for 5 years, and adding the volume of exchanging gas between the two countries is doubled. He also pointed to the employment of 900 elites of the Petroleum University of Technology, indigenization of technology or of technical know-how, and achievement of self-sufficiency in the construction of petrochemical plants, petrorefineries, and supplementary industries. The number of knowledge-based companies whose expertise is used by the government has soared from 150 to 550, added the minister. Augie said Iran's currently producing over 3 million barrels of oil per day, vowing 2 more refineries will become operational in the new Iranian calendar year, starting March 21st, 2023, to increase the country's refining capacity. Concluding his remarks, he said $260 million have been allotted to Phase 3 of Abadan Refinery. Iran says ready for new investment in its oil sector. A statement issued late on Sunday comes days after senior Saudi Arabian officials said his country would be ready for quick investment in Iranian development projects. Without naming any country or company, the oil ministry said any offer for investment in Iranian oil and gas projects, especially from members of the OPEC alliance of oil-producing nations, would be welcome in Tehran. It said any such investment would benefit the global security, as Iran is a leading holder of oil and gas reserves in the world, Press TV reported. Saudi Arabia is the largest oil exporter in the world and a leading member in the OPEC Plus grouping, which consists of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and allies like Russia. Iran is the third largest natural gas producer in the world and still a key supplier of crude oil to Asian markets, despite being subject to sanctions imposed by the U.S. since 2018. Political authorities from Iran and Saudi Arabia announced earlier this month in the Chinese capital, Beijing, that the two countries will restore their diplomatic relations by reopening embassies that had been closed in 2016. And the Iranian Minister of Energy, Marteza Shah Mirzai. Here's a clip from an interview with them.
Hello and welcome everybody.
At the outset, I wish to convey the greetings of all oil industrialists and all the technicians and engineers in the oil industry to all Iranians across the globe and all those who celebrate Nowruz. Today is the Oil Nationalization Day. It's an important day for the oil industry, and it's an important day for all those who operate in the oil industry across the globe. And this is an important event since it refers to the nationalization of the oil industry. So this is a major event in our history. It dates back to 72 years ago when the Iranian people and the technicians were after nationalizing the oil industry and also received the oil revenue. 114 years ago, when the first oil well was constructed in Masjid Suleiman, At that time, the British were in charge of the oil, and till 1329 Iranian calendar, there were some uprisings, and Nawab Safavi, as one of the employees of Abadan refinery, he stood in the face of this apartheid, and it also affected the parliament, and eventually on this date, with the efforts made by all the patriots, particularly the workers of the oil industry, the oil was nationalized at the Oil Commission of the Parliament, and since that time, all the technicians made efforts in order to have more value added from the oil industry. So this trend continued till the triumph of the Islamic Revolution, and many advisors from the US and US allies were present in Iran, and they were operating in our oil industry. With the victory of the revolution, they stopped working and they left our country. And we have a 12,000-year background. It's an honor for us. Many countries take our artifacts, take them to their museums, and they're proud of it. This indicates our rich historical background. And in the past 10 to 15 centuries, we have made a great deal of efforts, and we had this historical background till 1979, when the foreign advisors left the country, and at that time, domestic experts started operating the oil industry, and the production of oil and gas, petrochemical products, the production of these items were not halted even for a single day. It was the same after the outbreak of the war. And even though many of our oil and gas fields and our petrochemical hubs, and we had the petrochemical hub in Mahshar, it was attacked by the Ba'athist enemy. All our refinery oil and petrochemical units were operating, and we continued our exports. This indicates the glory and courage of the workers of the oil industry.
Quite a story behind this important day, but as we've already heard much about Iran's oil industry, but not so much about its petrochemical sector. Tell us a little bit about that, if you may. What is it exactly? What is it? What are our feedstock and products? How has it grown over the past 4 decades since the victory of the Islamic Republic?
Thank you. That's a very technical question. And in order to shed light on the growth dimensions of the growth of the oil industry, that's a fundamental question. Speaking of our oil and gas reserves, total reserves, if you convert it to oil barrels, that's the biggest reserve amongst all world countries. And therefore, such reserves can be quite supportive for our petrochemical industry. If you do not have the necessary feedstock, then the feedstock seller may just get engaged in tender, and this will stop your industry. That's exactly what happened in Europe last year. So we have major oil and gas reserves. We have the gas and liquid feedstock, but on the day of the victory of the revolution, the statistics show that we had 1.5 million barrels, 1.5 million of petrochemical products, I can refer to PVC polymer that were produced by Abadan refinery and also Mahshar refinery, and also other major products such as methanol. So after 44 years, we are celebrating Nowruz, and I can give this good news to all Iranians, across the globe, that we have exceeded the 92 million tons, 1.5 million tons production in 1979. It has reached 93 million tons today. This is a source of pride, and we have been under sanctions during all these years. In 1979, we had limited petrochemical products, but today we have over 550 grades of different petrochemical and polymer products. Even though we went through 8 years of war, and 2 years before the war, there were activities for disintegration, and also we had that was before the war, and after the war we had to go through the reconstruction phase. But you see that due to the efforts made today, we have reached approximately 93 million tons. It was always said that the oil industry is under sanctions, various restrictions were imposed upon us, but despite all these, we have reached this major figure. I'm pleased to announce that based on the 7th and 8th development plans, we are going to double the existing capacities with respect to our petrochemical products. Of course, in the early days of the victory of the revolution, we were dependent on various sectors, even though we were in charge of the oil industry when the foreign advisors left the country. But we were dependent in the field of catalysts, and we were dependent in the field of the licenses, and also in the field of designing, execution, and making operational, and even maintenance. We were not self-sufficient in these said areas, but today, on the eve of Nowruz, I can announce that, speaking of design, execution, and making operational, and also maintenance, we have no dependency today. We have become 100% self-sufficient.
Iran marks the 72nd anniversary of the nationalization of its oil industry, which was a significant step in the country's independence from the West. On March 20th, 1951, members of the Iranian parliament passed a bill introduced by the country's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh to nationalize the oil industry. The initiative made Iran the first country in West Asia to reclaim its oil industry from colonial powers. In retaliation, Britain and the United States imposed sanctions against Iran's oil sector and later colluded to stage a coup against the ex-premier's government in 1953. The CIA declassified documents of the incident in 2013, confirming Washington's footprints in the military overthrow of the Mossadegh administration.
On March 20,
country's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh to nationalize the oil industry. The initiative made Iran the first country in West Asia to reclaim its oil industry from colonial powers. In retaliation, Britain and the United States imposed sanctions against Iran's oil sector and later colluded to stage a coup against the ex-premier's government in 1953. The CIA declassified documents of the incident in 2013, confirming Washington's footprints in the military overthrow of the Mossadegh administration.
On March 20th, 1951, members of the Iranian parliament passed a bill introduced by the then Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh to nationalize the oil industry. Mossadegh received support from his nationalist party and religious groups, led by prominent cleric Ayatollah Kashani, for the initiative. The legislation put an end to 4 decades of British control on Iran's oil, which was conducted by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Britain used to pay only a small share of the oil excavations and exports to the Iranian government before the nationalization of Iran's oil industry.
3 important factors were involved in the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. The first factor was the national convergence towards this issue. The second factor was the strong bond among the nation, religious groups, and the Nationalist Party. The third was the rivalries among the so-called big powers of the time.
Following the nationalization of the oil industry in Iran, the US and Britain imposed international sanctions on Tehran in the early 1950s, which eventually saw the then Prime Minister Mossadegh out after an orchestrated coup against his government. Experts believe the nationalization of Iran's oil industry was one of the main reasons behind the 1953 Anglo-American coup, which overthrew the then Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. The coup saw the formation of an absolute US-backed monarchy under Iran's last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was overthrown by the 1979 Islamic Revolution. A few years ago, the US Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, published for the first time a document confirming Washington's role in the 1953 coup against the democratically elected government of Mossadegh.
The tangible benefits the United States gained from overthrowing Iran's elected government included a share of Iran's oil wealth, because before the nationalization of the oil industry, Britain was the only user of Iran's oil wealth.
Iran is the first country in the Middle East which has proclaimed the nationalization of the oil industry. The event is not only significant in the history of the Iranian nation's anti-colonialist campaign, but is a defining moment in the history of the political developments of the Middle East. Saman Kujuri, Press TV, Tehran.
And we'll be back with more news.
It is obvious to the most simple-minded that Lokai is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
The whole notion of logic.
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them?
The whole notion of
from
logic.
Some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I am chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, Approvable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
From Tasnim news agency, Israeli finance minister denies existence of Palestinians, sparking outrage. Israeli finance minister Bezalel Smotrich sparked outrage once again after claiming that Palestinian people are an invention of the past century, prompting Palestinian officials to denounce his comments as evidence of the Israelis' far-right cabinet's racist outlook. Smotrich, an ultranationalist who also oversees civilian administration in the occupied West Bank, made the remarks during a memorial for Jacques Kupfer, an activist for Israel's right-wing Likud party who died in 2021. In Paris on Sunday, Smotrich claimed that there is no such thing as the Palestinian people, adding that he himself is a Palestinian, referring to his late grandfather, who he said was a 13th-generation Jerusalemite and the true Palestinian. This is the second major controversy so hold on. Was he a Palestinian or not? If he was a Palestinian, then the Palestinian people exist. Palestinian people can only exist if they're your relatives. This is the second major controversy that Smotrich, well known for his hardline Zionist stance and repeated anti-Palestinian remarks, has ignited this month. Smotrich triggered international outrage on March 1st by calling for the Palestinian village of Hawara in the West Bank to be wiped out following a rampage for Israeli settlers. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh condemned Smotrich's latest remarks, saying they were conclusive evidence of the extremist racist Zionist ideology that governs the current Zionist cabinet. These inflammatory statements, which are consistent with the first Zionist claims of a land without a people for a people without a land, and that Palestinian lands are disputed, and which demonstrate the arrogance of power, Shtayyeh said at a PA cabinet session in Ramallah, do not shake our belonging to our land and our history, and that all archaeological remnants in history prove the attachment of the Palestinians to his land since the dawn of human history. From radio.gov, Radio Pakistan, radio.gov.pk. Palestine condemns Zionist minister's rejection of Palestinians. Palestine has called a Zionist minister's remarks denying the existence of the Palestine people conclusive evidence of the Zionist government's racist ideology. In a statement, Palestine Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh said the inflammatory statements made by Israeli Minister Bezalel Smotrich are consistent with the first Zionist sayings of a land without a people for a people without a land. Meanwhile, the EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell called on the Zionist government to disavow its minister's comments. Talking to newsmen in Brussels, he said these comments cannot be tolerated. And from The Citizen, Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh speaks to the press as he visits Hawara in the occupied West Bank. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh on Monday blasted as inflammatory remarks made by far-right Israeli Foreign Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich that Palestinians do not exist. There are no Palestinians because there's no Palestinian people, Smotrich said Sunday, quoting French Zionist activist Jacques Kupfer, speaking at an event in Paris according to a video circulating on social media. After 200 years of exile, the prophecies of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah are beginning to come true, and Allah is gathering his people. The people of Zionism are returning home, Smotrich said. These are Arabs who don't like it, so what do? They invent a fictitious people and claim fictitious rights to the land of Israel, only to fight the Zionist movement, he added. This is ironic? Since Smotrich last year became a minister in the cabinet of Zionists veteran leader Benjamin Netanyahu, which analysts have called the most right-wing government in the country's history. It's the historical truth. It's the biblical truth. The Arabs and Zionists must hear it, as well as certain Jews who are confused. In Israel, this truth must be heard here at the Élysée Palace in Paris, and at the White House in Washington. Everyone must hear this truth. Shtayyeh, speaking before a cabinet meeting of the Palestinian Authority on Monday, said the inflammatory statements are consistent with the first Zionist sayings of a land without a people for a people without a land. He said the comments were conclusive evidence of the extremist racist Zionist ideology of the current government. Smotrich and his religious Zionism group have history of making incendiary remarks about Palestinian people. In February, Smotrich called for the Palestinian town of Huwara in the occupied West Bank to be wiped out after 2 Zionists were shot dead by an alleged Hamas militant. Hundreds of rampaging Zionist settlers, Zionist occupiers, later torched Palestinian homes and cars in the West Bank town. I'm going to open up a channel. Beam me up.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark. Beam me up.
Lock on transporters. Beam us up.
Beam us up, quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Mr. Scott, prepare to beam us up.
Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast.
Stand by to beam us up.
Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.